All right. Well, it is 2 o'clock. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Stacy Heaton here, the Executive Director for the Ohio Aviation Association. And welcome to our latest webinar on understanding and responding to human trafficking in Ohio. With us today, we have Sophia. Sophia, give a wave if people can see you. We have Sophia Papadimos, who is the Anti-Trafficking Coordinator at the Ohio Department of Public Safety. In her role, she manages the governor's Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force and works with state agencies, service providers, and local coalitions to strengthen Ohio's response to trafficking. Also with Sophia, we have Tara. Tara, give a wave. Hello. We have Tara Alston, also with the Ohio Department of Transportation, and serves as ODOT's Anti-Trafficking Coordinator. So ladies, thank you very much for taking the time to put together a presentation to educate our members. Real quick, just remember the background of our members are, we are primarily airports, airport managers, people that are on the fields, in the terminals, both general aviation and commercial. So with that, Sophia, I will turn it over to you. And when you need me to fast forward your slide, just give me a little clue and I will take care of it for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy. Thank you for having me today, everyone. And thank you, Tara, for joining me in this presentation. As Stacy mentioned, my name is Sophia, and I work at the Ohio Department of Public Safety's Office of Criminal Justice Services. And in my role, I work with the governor's Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But my goal for today is to really give everyone an understanding of what human trafficking looks like here in Ohio, perhaps dispel some myths that people may think of human trafficking, and then really hand it over to Tara for her to just share some experience with her space and transportation and give you guys a little bit more specific examples as how this can relate to your field and kind of what you all do day to day. So with that, we can go to the next slide, Stacy.
So we think. There we go.
So to break down my presentation a little bit for today, I really want to just go over some of our federal and state definitions, talk a little bit about the scope of trafficking, and then also what it looks like in Ohio. We'll cover some signs and indicators and then finish out on hopefully a less depressing note on what we're doing as a state to combat this issue. Next slide, please. So understanding the crime. Human trafficking is quite complicated, and this is my full-time job, and there are still cases that come across my desk where I kind of need to look at it and break down, okay, how does this rise to the level of trafficking as opposed to another egregious crime? So human trafficking in its most simplest form is a crime in which people profit from the control and exploitation of others. So actually in Ohio law, it's referred to as the compelled service of others for profit. And that for-profit piece is just so important because in order for this, once again, to be human trafficking, someone must be profiting off the exploitation of someone else. And so when we think of profit, I think initially we think of, of some type of financial gain, which can many times be the case, but we also see people profit off others for drugs, for alcohol, for a place to stay. Unfortunately, there isn't a shortage in ways you can profit off someone else for free labor. We'll talk about labor trafficking a little bit today. So the other key piece when we talk about trafficking, besides profit, is that force, fraud, or coercion piece. So in order for something to rise, once again, to that level of human trafficking, the crime must include elements of force, fraud, or coercion. So for example, force, is a little bit more clear, that physical restraint, that physical force. Fraud is what we often see with trafficking, especially labor trafficking. That false promise of a good job, that false promise of sending someone for a better education. And so we'll talk through some case examples. Or coercion, which is the threat of serious harm against someone else. So we'll go into that detail a little bit more in a few slides. But next slide, please. So to break down trafficking, this is a model from Polaris, which is a national organization out of DC who has really just done a lot in this in this field championing legislation. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but this is the AMP model. So this breaks down trafficking and what you need to have in order for it to occur. So an action means purpose model. So when we talk about trafficking, that recruiting, harboring, transporting, some type of action by the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation or forced labor. So we hear a lot about sex trafficking in the media. We don't hear as much about labor trafficking. And I'm going to get into that a little bit about, I think, some of the reasons behind that. But there are two types of trafficking. So it is beyond that commercial sexual exploitation. When we talk about forced labor, that could be an instance of profiting off someone in the construction industry or in the agriculture industry. I'm going to give just a brief narrative of a situation of trafficking in which there was forced labor. We work with a survivor who has given us permission to share his story, but he was recruited to come to the U.S., so that recruitment piece right there, right, for the action. Being offered a job as a project manager. He was someone who held a master's level degree, was doing pretty well in his country, but was offered to come on an H-1B visa to the US. So by the means, so that means was this job opportunity, which ended up being fraudulent. So when he arrived in the US, his trafficker had said, I need to make a copy of your passport. I need to, have your documentations to put them on file for your job. So he handed those over thinking this is just, part of my onboarding process. And in fact, his documents were seized. He had come over with his entire family, so his wife and his children as well, and ended up being forced to work in a restaurant 7 days a week for minimal pay in the circumstances, horrific living circumstances, not at all what he had signed up for. But what the trafficker was using was saying, well, I have your documents. You're no longer here legally, and I will call immigration. So that actually falls into coercion as well. So that threat or threatened abuse of the legal process is a form of coercion when we talk about trafficking. And for the purpose, it was for forced labor. It was to have him work in this restaurant for almost free, essentially. So that situation, he ended up being able to leave, but it was after several years of being in that situation, and it wasn't until the FBI got involved and some service providers to help, and his family now is thriving over this. This occurred back about 10 years ago, but it's just, unfortunately, when you look at how people will exploit someone else, there's just not a shortage. So that hopefully gives you an example of the AMP model. There is one caveat to that model, though. So Stacy, if you'll go to the next slide. So when we talk about force, fraud, or coercion, right, I mentioned those pieces are critical when we're talking about the case of human trafficking. In the United States, you do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion if the victim is under the age of 18 years old and they're a victim of sex trafficking. So the thought process behind that law was, if you're under the age of 18, you cannot legally consent to sex. Therefore, you cannot legally consent to a commercial sex act. So it's really important because proving force, fraud, or coercion can be very challenging in these cases. And so if you're under the age of 18, you do not have to prove that piece. I mean, that was federal law, or is federal law, I should say, and Ohio just recently had a law change within the past month that now reflects that federal law as well. For a while in Ohio, you did have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for 16 and 17-year-olds, which made some of those prosecutions rather challenging. And this is just in the case of sex trafficking, so the commercial sexual exploitation, because in the case of labor trafficking, you're very much allowed to work as a 16-year-old in the state of Ohio, right? You can get a job at the mall. You can have employment. So that's why force, fraud, or coercion still needs to be proven in the cases of labor trafficking. Next slide, please. So once again, just breaking down that force, fraud, or coercion piece, is once again is really the crux of trafficking. This is from the Salvation Army of Central Ohio, but they just kind of put it on paper how these appear. So like I mentioned, force is a little bit more obvious: physical assault, confinement. I will say a lot of trafficking campaigns from years ago, and there are some still that unfortunately use this, that image of being confined or chained in a basement, that is really not an accurate depiction of trafficking. I think it did a good job of grabbing people's attention at the time, but the idea that someone is physically bound is not necessarily the case. Traffickers are very sophisticated. They use manipulation tactics. They use, exploiting vulnerabilities, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I just want people to really understand that this idea of someone being confined to a basement, it can happen, but it is far less likely to see. So going over fraud, I kind of highlighted an example, that active deception with criminal intent. So we've seen that with people working in homes who end up in domestic servitude. We've seen that in the agriculture industry within Ohio. And going on to coercion, once again, that threat of serious harm against any person. So what we'll sometimes see with traffickers is, oh, well, if you try and leave or you don't want to do this anymore, do you want to do this anymore? It's not obviously a choice. Then I know where your sister lives, or I know your friend down the street. So that threat of hurting someone else is a form of coercion as well. So hopefully that gives a clear picture of what human trafficking is. And we can go to the next slide. So the nature and scope of trafficking. I think one of the first questions people always ask is, how big of a crime is this? Is this really, like, what does this really look like? So data is very hard to come by when we talk about human trafficking. I used to co-train with a law enforcement officer who would say, when there's a burglary, you're called onto the scene, it's very clear. Something is broken, something's been missing. There is a sign that a crime has occurred. With trafficking, that's just not always the case. It's sometimes looking a little deeper. It does not always just appear to have happened. So I think part of that is challenging can be challenging to identify, but then also subsequently collect the data. Because sometimes when you're called to a crime, it's not necessarily clear that trafficking is occurring, and you might get a drug charge or a solicitation charge or a prostitution charge. There may be other charges that don't necessarily equate to trafficking right away. Now, having said all that, the International Labor Organization did do a study. This is from 2017 now, it's their most recent one, in which they estimated about 24.8 million people thought to be trafficked globally. And interestingly enough, looking at that, a majority of the victims were labor trafficking victims, not sex trafficking victims. But we hear so much more about sex trafficking. And I think that that's for several reasons. One of them being, if you are not engaging in commercial sex or purchasing sex, I think you can hear about it and it can really tug at people's heartstrings and say, like, that's horrible. I'm not involved in that, but how terrible. Like, I'm not contributing to that problem. And when we talk about forced labor, it's just not as clear, right? And not putting blame on anyone, but looking at supply chains, looking at where you're eating, what are those employees actually being treated like? Talking about construction industry. So I think that there is just, we're not necessarily removed from that. Unfortunately, we could all in some way be benefiting off, unbeknownst to us, some type of forced labor. So I think it's just something that we need as a state to get better at identifying, and that's one of our priorities and understanding. But I just think it is interesting that globally, when you look at it, sex trafficking survivors take up a much smaller percentage. Additionally, we have a photo here. For obvious reasons, you don't have a lot of images of human trafficking, but our State Department does release a trafficking in persons report every year, kind of analyzing countries' response to trafficking. And so this was a photo taken in Bolivia in which a child was being forced to work in the mining sector. And so I just think it's important to highlight that trafficking doesn't just affect women. It affects men, women, and children across the globe. And so this is, I think, just an unfortunate reality when we think about human trafficking. I think at least a lot of the kind of elementary trainings I do, people assume it's mostly, young girls or just women who are affected by sex trafficking, but it's really a larger scope than that. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Ohio's data. So some of the data that we are able to collect is through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I mentioned the organization Polaris before. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And in some instances, I think the media has reported that Ohio has the 5th worst trafficking problem in the states, or in the past we've had or they've reported it as the 4th. That's not exactly an accurate representation. So we have had the 5th highest number of cases reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So in 2019, we had 450 cases that were verified as human trafficking cases reported to the hotline. It's important to note that not every state utilizes the hotline. Our state has done, I think, an excellent job of promoting it, of putting it out there. In fact, in Ohio Revised Code, it requires that my office, anything we produce that's a public awareness material, includes the national hotline number. So I just like to give Ohio a little bit of credit there, because I think this shows that we have an informed population and people are really calling the hotline with concerns. However, I don't necessarily think it makes us the 5th worst state in the country for trafficking. When looking at that 2019 data, and this is the most recent data we have, the hotline has not released 2020 data yet. We do see more sex trafficking cases. So 314 sex trafficking cases and then 44 labor trafficking cases. And so there is a discrepancy there in terms of we're seeing more sex trafficking than labor trafficking. And if we go to the next slide, there is looking back actually to 2018 data, but the 2019 data is relatively comparable. But I mentioned earlier the International Labor Organization, and their data estimates roughly 80% of trafficking is labor trafficking. When you look nationally at the human trafficking hotline data, labor trafficking accounts for about only 11% of the reported cases. Now, as I mentioned, not all cases get to the hotline. That is you have to report that to get it there, and not all law enforcement uses that hotline. So I think there are some reasons for discrepancy, but that's a very large discrepancy, right? If we're saying globally 80% of trafficking is labor trafficking, and then only 11% is in the US, when we ask people about it, or we've talked about it, one of the things that comes up is, well, the US has better labor laws than some countries. So, that's partially why. And I think that could account for some of it. I don't think it can account for a 69% difference. But I think also, once again, labor trafficking is harder to identify. When we talk about sex trafficking, there is a predicate criminal offense, right? Prostitution is not legal in Ohio. So when you see that, not that all prostitution is trafficking, but you have an entry point to kind of dig deeper. Labor trafficking happens in perfectly legal venues. It is not illegal to eat or work at a restaurant. It is not illegal to work in construction. It is not illegal to be a home health aide. So it is just not as apparent. And it can often be a term we use within this field, like hidden in plain sight. So you don't necessarily see that trafficking occurring. So I know that one of the goals of the governor's task force for this year in 2022 is to really look at how can we identify strategies to better identify labor trafficking? How can we help law enforcement prosecute these cases? Labor trafficking cases can be incredibly resource intensive. So just really trying to find strategies to improve this response. Next slide. So going back to Polaris, that national organization I keep mentioning, which is just really a wonderful resource and just have a wealth of information on this topic. Several years ago, they created a typology report of modern day slavery, going through the 25 most common venues in which trafficking occurred based on the calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So some of these may be more obvious, if you will: escort services, illicit massage. But some, I think, I know when I first read this list a few years ago, I was more surprised by when we talk about peddling and begging, restaurant and food service, traveling sales crews. So there have been cases of Ohio, where people come and knock on your door and asking to sell stuff, where those have actually been cases of trafficking. And so really just a wide range in which this can occur. Next slide. So to talk a little bit more specifically about human trafficking within Ohio, people often ask, well, who is a common trafficker? Like, what does the typical trafficker look like? Unfortunately, there is not necessarily a specific profile for a trafficking. I think that idea of a sketchy man in a hoodie in an alley is just unfortunately not how we see trafficking. We have seen traffickers be parents, caregivers, employers. We have seen, that pimp as a trafficker as well, men and women. So I think it's important to note women are also traffickers, right? When we talk about how trafficking occurs, especially how sex trafficking occurs, it's often exploiting a relationship, exploiting a vulnerability. And women are more inclined to trust other women, I think, in many cases. So I think it's important to note that females can be traffickers, have been traffickers, are serving time as traffickers in Ohio, and it is not just a crime perpetrated by men. So this is a newspaper clipping from a Dayton roofing company, actually, in which the owner was trafficking employees and not allowing them to leave, not really paying them. So it's just, once again, a roofing company isn't what you think of as someone who would be trafficking, but that is definitely a case we have seen in Ohio. Next slide, please. So what goes hand in hand with what does a trafficker look like is the same as what does your typical victim look like? And once again, there just is not a demographic profile for a victim of human trafficking. When we talk about trafficking, it disproportionately affects vulnerable people. So we all have vulnerabilities, right? Some of the more common vulnerabilities, if you will, that we have seen are foreign nationals who are documented or undocumented, runaway and homeless youth, so also youth who may be involved in the juvenile justice or foster care system, individuals with substance use disorders, people with developmental disabilities, kids with a history of abuse. So unfortunately, traffickers are able to kind of pick out some of these vulnerabilities, if you will. There's a survivor who we work with who has said, like, my trafficker could spot me a mile away. I had a substance use disorder. He befriended me. He offered to feed that addiction. He then, had a romantic interest in me. And so that is how we often see these cases of trafficking occurring. It's not the idea that someone is just kidnapped off the street and then forced into this. It is much more sophisticated. Often the survivors who we work with, who access services, don't refer to their trafficker as a trafficker. That was their boyfriend, that was their partner, that was the father of their child. It is not a case in which it is someone who is a stranger necessarily trafficking you. Of course, that can occur. That's just not what we most commonly see. There is a relationship there. So unfortunately, with that comes trauma bonding, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But oftentimes people are asked, well, why didn't they just leave? Well, it's much more complicated than that. Another law enforcement officer I work with said he responded to his first trafficking case, and he got on scene, and he just thought he really thought they were going to just welcome him with open arms. Like, oh my gosh, you're saving me. And this woman was so upset. He took her cell phone. She's like, I'm fine. Leave me alone. I don't have any problem. It's once again that not identifying as a victim and not necessarily seeking that help. So, not so much with this audience, obviously, but we've really had to work with law enforcement to kind of shift the mentality of kind of the expectations when working with survivors of human trafficking and what that looks like. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the cases that we have seen in Ohio, just to give you a broad understanding of what this has actually looked like. So I don't know if you all are familiar with this case. It initially was opened in 2015, but it was a case of labor trafficking in Ohio. And actually, PBS did a documentary on it. So if you are very intrigued and want more information, you can look online to find it at Frontline. However, this is a case in which the traffickers were from Guatemala and approached families in Guatemala and had said, we can send your kids to the US to get a great education, live that American dream, be in a better circumstance. Well, and it'll only cost you $15,000. And the parents, did not have that kind of money, but did want to send their kids to the US. They just wanted to better their kids' lives, which I think any normal parents, hope for their child. And instead of $15,000, they signed over the deeds to their house. So the kids were brought over the border and apprehended by immigration and put in the unaccompanied minors program. And so this is, once again, talking about the sophistication of traffickers. This was their plan all along for these minors to be apprehended. The traffickers then came forward with forged documents saying, we're family, you can release them to us, we will sponsor them in Ohio. Those kids were subsequently released to the hands of traffickers, and were not given a great education, were in fact forced to work on an egg farm, debeaking chickens, vaccinating chickens, working 16, 18-hour days, living in atrocious conditions without running water. It was a horrible case, and it wasn't just minors involved. I'm focusing on minors because that was a larger piece of it, but adults were also trafficked in this case. And what cracked the case open was one of the kids was able to get a cell phone and call his uncle in Florida, who then called the National Human Trafficking Hotline, who triaged that call to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District and opened up the case. And so that is how, so when we talk about the national hotline, which I'll kind of continue to talk through without and give you the number at the end of the presentation, it is one number for people to access help in all of our states. So I think it's really important. But this case, once again, so this was in 2015 when charges were initially brought. As of 2020, there were new charges brought against someone else. So when I talk about time intensive and resource intensive, this is what I'm talking about. We're talking over 5 years of an investigation and people are still being indicted. So this is one instance of labor trafficking, and this is just in Marion, Ohio, right outside of Columbus. But we have an agriculture state, right? So part of my job is working with some of different service providers to do outreach on some of these agricultural settings. And as a result of this, we worked with the Department of Health and the Department of Agriculture to train their inspectors on trafficking. So while yes, you're going in to look for a health code violation or a livestock violation, you are in fact also going in to look for a human rights violation. So next slide, please. This is a case of sex trafficking, just to kind of show the other side of it as well, in which a Toledo man was sentenced to 35 years for sex trafficking a minor. This is someone who had run away from home. He met her online and then ended up offering her out to other people for commercial sex acts. So once again, social media playing a large role in trafficking and what we see. The internet, is a wonderful place, but also with the click of a button, you can buy or sell just about anything, including, unfortunately, in this case, people. But he did receive 35 years. Trafficking is a first-degree felony in Ohio, so he was sentenced to 35 years, and this is the case from 2019. Next slide, please. I mentioned illicit massage. I don't know how familiar people are with that. We have illicit massage businesses all over Ohio, all over central Ohio. And this was a case in which there were two sisters who were offering and recruiting women from China to come and work in this massage parlor, but were then subsequently trafficking them, forcing them not only to just provide regular massage, but also then provide sexual services to people coming in. And this was just in a strip mall in Delaware. Like, it was in a suburb, doesn't look conspicuous necessarily. There were 18 victims identified in this case, and both sisters are currently serving time. They were actually unable to get them on a trafficking charge, but if you can see, it was on promoting prostitution, money laundering, practicing medicine without a license, because in Ohio, if you are advertising as massage therapy, you actually have to be licensed by the Medical Board of Ohio. That massage therapy is really the key, is how medical board can investigate. But once again, just highlighting kind of the different types of trafficking we've seen within Ohio. For the survivors who were identified, there are federal laws in place in which people can seek visas to stay in this country. So several of them did go that route and were awarded their T visas, so they're able to remain in the US. Some chose to go back to China. But just once again, highlighting these were two sisters running the trafficking ring, offering other women jobs to come to the US. Next slide, please. This is a particularly challenging case. Not that, I think when we speak of trafficking, unfortunately, it is a heavier topic. But this is, when we talk about the opiate crisis in Ohio, I think that we're not always talking about all the effects of it, right? We have a problem here in Ohio. And one of the things that we are seeing is parents or grandparents trafficking their children to feed that addiction. So this was a case in which a woman, she was sentenced to 51 years for trafficking her child. So once again, a really hard thing to talk about. But when we talk about trafficking, I think it's important to understand it's not always that street-based forced prostitution. In rural counties, we see this often, and what we're hearing from child advocacy centers who serve these kids, or they are younger and younger. So of course, this is not something that the legal system takes lightly. She was sentenced to 51 years. But once again, demonstrating another avenue in which trafficking can occur within Ohio. Next slide, please. So signs and indicators. I always am a little bit hesitant when I talk through this because I think it's important to take into context the whole person and the whole situation as much as you can. But when we talk about some signs and indicators of trafficking, some of the things that pop up is someone living and working on site? Are they sleeping where they're working? Are they able to come and go as they please? Are they unpaid or paid very little? So trafficking victims can be paid, but usually it's not much. Someone who may be working excessively long hours or unusual hours, or isn't allowed to take a break. So for example, there was a survivor who was working in a restaurant who ended up going to the emergency room because for a chronic pain and injury in his hand from just grinding meat all day. He was never allowed to take breaks, and it ended up resulting in an ER visit. So that is also why it's important that we work with our healthcare providers to understand which questions they should be asking. Someone who may owe a large debt and is unable to pay it off. Someone who was recruited through false promises. We also talk a lot about security measures. So I'll never forget, where I used to live in Columbus, right across the street, there was a strip mall with a massage parlor in it that always seemed closed. I mean, people were coming in and out, but the blinds were always shut. It was always dim lighting. Well, there were so many security cameras outside. It was like a relatively safe neighborhood. No one else in the strip mall had that type of security. And anyway, I would call Columbus PD regularly being like, I know trafficking is occurring in here, but that's just to say that really looking at what is being monitored so closely. So when we talk about bars, barbed wire, things that just may not be what seem to be a natural security measure. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the actual person, we often see trafficking survivors be very fearful, anxious, depressed, especially when we're talking about law enforcement. I think there's a natural fear. Someone who may avoid eye contact. Traffickers are not necessarily providing any type of health care for these victims or survivors. So a lack of health care, a lack of dental care, appearing malnourished. Of course, any type of physical sign. Physical restraint is problematic and could be an indicator of trafficking. Next slide, please. When we talk about a lack of control, so someone who doesn't have many possessions, who's not in control of their own documents or their own money, not allowed to speak for themselves, is kind of like waiting for permission for someone else to speak. Also a lack of clarity. So someone who's unable to say where they live or where they are, or where their address is, where they're going to be staying, don't know what city they're in. So, and I think this is for a few reasons. When we talk about trafficking and abuse, there's often traumatic brain injury involved, which can cause like a loss of the ability to kind of have a linear sense of time. So that would lead to like inconsistencies in their stories. But I think also part of it is someone who's experiencing that, it's a day-to-day struggle to stay alive, right? So your ability to stay alive is based on your ability to lie. That's just the truth. I mean, and service providers have said, like, we don't fault our clients for coming in off the bat and lying to us, because that's how they've been able to kind of navigate a situation and stay alive this far. So that's all to say that a lack of clarity and awareness could be for several reasons, but also just that in general could be an indicator of trafficking. So I've talked a little bit about this and challenges to identifying victims. Just the hidden nature, which I mentioned earlier, and not self-identifying. We work with the Salvation Army of Central Ohio, and this was an up-to-date fact pre-COVID, so it's probably a little bit different now. But I think at that point in time, they had served over 900 victims of trafficking, and only 2 had ever come in and said, like, I'm a victim of trafficking. That language just is not articulated or utilized when talking to survivors. I think traffickers are often coach their victims through threats, instill fear, sometimes through violence to not come forward for help. There's a shame in it, right? Like, there unfortunately shouldn't be, but this is something that's really traumatic that's happened to someone. Trafficking victims often blame themselves for their situation. Well, if I hadn't done this or I hadn't done that, when in fact, it's not their fault, right? Someone is exploiting you and breaking the law. But there is a shame associated with it and a strong stigma in often cases. Mistrust of authorities. I mean, we have that with US born victims, but we also see that with foreign nationals who may not have any type of faith in their kind of legal system, law enforcement. That trauma bond with traffickers, as I mentioned earlier, if you share a child with your trafficker, that is a challenging thing to navigate and come forward and press charges and testify against. I also think that language barriers play a role when we're talking about foreign nationals, and also just a lack of understanding by the community. So many people think that if you haven't accessed help, if you've been in public and not said something, then you couldn't possibly be a trafficking victim, right? If you weren't kidnapped or forced to do this, you couldn't, or like physically forced, then you aren't a trafficking victim. And I just think it's so important to understand all of these pieces that prevent people from coming forward, that doesn't lessen their victimization, right? So a part of that is my job, is working with communities to understand, like, what is trafficking? How does this actually occur? What does this look like? Try and dispel some of those concerns about kids being trafficked or kidnapped, I should say. And so I think the best way for me to explain it is traffickers, unfortunately, operate from a financial point. That's their viewpoint, right? We're trying to make money, as much money as we can off people. And if you kidnap someone, their knee-jerk reaction is going to run the second they have an out, right? If you've been to just escape that situation. And traffickers are much more sophisticated than that, right? They're building that relationship. They're grooming that person so that if that person is out in public, they're not necessarily going to run from you. They've kind of developed that trauma bond, if you will. So unfortunately, this just adds to the list of how it can be very challenging to identify a victim. Next slide, please. So now that I've inundated you with relatively depressing information, I would like to share that we are trying to do something about this in our state, and kind of what we're working on and what my role is within Ohio. So if you want to click, Stacey, you can just click them all. I think they'll kind of pop up. Excuse me. So we are really fortunate in Ohio to have a lot of advocacy and victim services at the grassroots level. So we have coalitions throughout the state, different service providers throughout the state who are really leading this charge within their community. As people like to say, we have 88 counties in Ohio and 88 different ways of doing things. So depending on your county, your response may look slightly differently. We are fortunate to have law enforcement task forces in Ohio that are specifically charged with prosecuting and investigating trafficking cases. So we have a federal FBI task force up in Northwest Ohio that specifically focuses on kids. We have a task force in Cleveland and Cuyahoga, Central Ohio. We have one that's forming in the Cincinnati area, and then also one up in Summit County that's forming. So we are fortunate to have more and more of these law enforcement task forces pop up. We could always use more though. We also have laws now. So before 2000, this wasn't articulated in federal law. There was no crime of trafficking prior to 2000. And state laws, Ohio didn't have a law before 2010. And even then, we're like continually trying to strengthen that law. And as recent as January of this year, you know, House Bill 431 passed and the governor signed it a few weeks ago, which strengthened our law a little bit more, as I mentioned, giving those protections to 16 and 17-year-olds. And we also have state agency initiatives. So I'll just share a little bit about the Governor's Human Trafficking Task Force before I hand it over to Tara. Next slide. So this was created in 2012 by the former administration to really marshal the resources of the state to provide a more coordinated human trafficking response, recognizing that some state agencies were doing different initiatives, but there wasn't necessarily that cohesive effort to respond to trafficking. So the 10 state agencies listed in the executive order included Public Safety, Department of Agriculture, Department of Youth Services, Job and Family Services, agencies that just appeared to have that direct nexus to trafficking. So those agencies came together and issued 26 recommendations. One of them being, what does our response look like at the state? How can we organize these efforts? So it was creating the position of having an anti-trafficking coordinator. And my boss always jokes that public safety drew the short stick, and that's how they got me. So now we have a team of 3, and in all seriousness, we are very fortunate to be at public safety. Our office is set up within the Office of Criminal Justice Services, which we have grant teams and data and policy and research. And I think we're just well positioned to kind of look at this crime through a criminal justice lens. But the most important thing about this task force is our state agency initiatives are based on work that we do with coalitions, with service providers. You know, when you're making those policy decisions, it's best that they're informed by people who are actually doing the work and providing direct service in the field. So like I said, created in 2012, when Governor DeWine came into office, he kept the Human Trafficking Task Force and continued to make it a priority. Our team got to grow by several people. So we are fortunate to have that leadership here. Next. And then we have our coalitions. So in a perfect world, the state of Ohio would be completely colored with a response to trafficking in every county. But that is, of course, just not how it works. So we have coalitions in, I think, roughly 69 of our 88 counties. And granted, what those look like vary depending on your county. So in Central Ohio, that purple you see, there is a full continuum of care. So the national hotline will call the Salvation Army. They will triage that call 24/7. And they will work with people years if they need to. In some counties, they're just starting out. So you have training, awareness, maybe going into a school and doing a presentation. So part of my role is to go to these counties and provide support, provide that technical assistance, and then go into some of these counties that are white that may not have that response and try and build that. So I always think it's important to say, it's not that there's, you know, there may be organizations in some of these counties that are white that do serve victims of trafficking. They may have, you know, services for folks. Law enforcement may look into some of those cases, but there has not been a multidisciplinary team come together to say, we're going to address this issue. So that is a starting point of, if you want to get involved in this issue, if you want to learn more about it, to look at this coalition map at humantrafficking.ohio.gov. But I want to be cognizant of our time. So Tara, I'm going to hand it over to you to speak a little bit more specifically about ODOT and initiatives in the transportation sector.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. As Stacy had mentioned earlier, I work for the Ohio Department of Transportation. I'm the anti-trafficking coordinator there. How it started was I had learned a little bit about human trafficking and had started trying to think of different ways that we might be able to have an impact in anti-trafficking efforts, we being ODOT. And I worked on some different ideas and had collaborated with some individuals to implement these ideas. But I wanted to share some of those things with you because I think it helps sometimes when trying to think of different ways that you could help in a certain area, to hear maybe some of the brainstorming efforts of someone else to get your brain going. So one of the things that ODOT is responsible for is issuing oversized, overweight special hauling permits to any driver coming through the state of Ohio with an oversized or overweight load. I actually started working at ODOT in that area, and so that was one of the first things that I had thought of, and just how our truck stops are often a place where human trafficking occurs. And so just thinking about maybe how these truck drivers could impact those situations and getting awareness information out to them. So we issue approximately 350,000 permits per year. And we were able to add awareness information to those permits so that each and every one that's printed and given to the drivers before they drive through the state of Ohio with those loads, they have that awareness information with them. It gives them some of the information that you learned about today, such as signs and indicators. It tells them what to do, what not to do if they feel that there is a situation occurring, and provides the national hotline number and text information. I saw one of the questions that had come in today while Sophia was talking was, is there a text way to reach the National Human Trafficking Hotline? And there is, and that I believe will be included in this information too, but you can text BEFREE, BEFREE, and that gets you through to the National Human Trafficking Hotline as well. Something else that ODOT is responsible for is registration of private planes. So we send out registration packets yearly to the private plane owners to have them register their planes again for each year. There are about 8,000 mailed each year, and we have been able to include awareness information in those as well. Brainstormed a little bit more and thought about the rest areas that ODOT oversees. I think there's about 84 rest areas that we oversee. So those now include awareness information as well. We have monitors, like the TV monitors, out in many of those locations. So we have awareness information playing, we have posters hung up. We have also worked with the Governor's Task Force in having what we're calling tearaway stickers placed. They're placed in every stall of every restroom in the rest areas that we oversee. And they have little tear-offs that can be pulled off by possible victims with the National Human Trafficking Hotline number on them. So they can take a very small piece of paper with them that they might be able to utilize later. So those are just some of the ways, including, talking to people that we have connections with. So we began discussions with local transportation companies. So just trying to think of different ways continually that we'll be able to reach out, provide awareness information, provide training, just anything that we can do to help make an impact. Sophia talked about a lot of the things that traffickers do. One of the things that they do is move their victims around a lot to try to keep them a little bit disoriented about where they are, or trying to keep them away from any type of connection that they could make that would assist them. They use our transportation systems to move those victims around. And air travel is one of those key ways that traffickers do move their victims around. So it's important that you in the aviation industry are really remaining aware, I guess, of your surroundings, so that if you see something, you're able to say something. So we have the opportunity to anonymously report. So if you contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline, whether it's by telephone or by text, you're able to do that anonymously. You do not have to give your information if you're not comfortable to do that. I wanted to provide you a couple of examples that may hit home in your industry with recent events that have occurred with charges of trafficking. And one of which was in 2020, so just last year, there was a charter jet company CEO, Paul Alexander, who was based out of New York. He was arrested for trafficking girls as young as 12. They basically caught him because he tried to strike a deal, didn't realize it was with an undercover officer. He had showed nude photos and set up virtual like telephone meetings so that they were set up like meet and greets with these victims and who he thought was going to be a buyer. And so that is one of the examples that I thought you may be interested in hearing. And then another one we're probably a lot more familiar with is, I'm sure most of you have heard of Jeffrey Epstein. He was the billionaire with many of the elite connections who was charged with human trafficking in the past couple of years. He used private planes and helicopters to transport victims to and from the Virgin Islands, where a lot of his instances occurred. So, you know, those are just a couple of examples that I'm sure in the aviation industry, like you're able to relate with a little bit as far as why it's so important for us to remain aware of our surroundings and maybe have the possibility of helping a victim by reporting that information, because the things that they experience are horrific. So anything that we can do that would impact even just one life, I think is really important. But all of this started causing me to brainstorm, like I said, about who do we have influence with, who are our contracts with. That's something I'm going to be looking at in the near future as far as trying to meet with our contractors. Like, where do we have opportunities to be able to make a difference, whether it's just spreading awareness or making sure that people know what to look for. So everybody could have a part to play as far as how you can make an impact. And reporting that suspicious activity is really important. And then just brainstorming, you know, maybe you're able to share the information that you learned today with family or friends, or somebody, a connection that you think may be interested, so that they could also be aware of their surroundings and continue to share the information. So any questions that you might have, we'll give you an opportunity today too, but if you think of anything later, we're more than happy to have you reach out to us and ask questions, or if there's any additional information that you might need, any type of awareness materials. So we just want to make sure that you know that we're a resource as well as you're navigating all of this and trying to figure out how you can play a part.
And I just dropped my email in the chat box as well.
I will do the same.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Tara and Sophia. So a little bit, you know, just trying to brainstorm how our members might be able to assist. Many of our members have, even the general aviation, they have little terminals where aircraft might need to be fueled. They could have a whole separate provider that provides a fueling service, and like a restroom where that guests or passengers of aircraft would need to go in and use it. So if there are flyers, if there are things like that that you believe could be useful, I can most definitely put that out to our members and encourage them to hang, to post, just, you know, be generally aware, share with their other tenants around the airport. I think that is most definitely an easy ask for our members. So if there are items like PDFs that I can send out, that's probably the easiest way for me to get it out to our members, but I can offer that.
Thank you so much. We can definitely get you some, Stacy.
Perfect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's about 6 minutes left, and I want to let you know that you can unmute yourself and ask a question of these two ladies if you are interested, if you've got some questions, or feel free to type it into the chat box.
Good afternoon. This is David Regula with the Akron-Canton Airport. I know that TSA also has a human trafficking program, and I just wondered how this could be interfaced with the Ohio program, the Ohio Aviation Association, and the TSA. I mean, do they complement one another, for lack of a better word, or is it two separate entities doing their thing?
I definitely think they complement each other. So, well, prior to COVID, we would have different briefings with TSA. And I know when we created a training video for airports, which we're in the process of updating because it is quite outdated. It's from several years ago. TSA was heavily involved in that. So we do try and share information. I know in cases where airports have been notified, or there has been a concern, I should say, with trafficking within an airport. If I get that tip, I always contact my my contact at TSA to let them know what I'm hearing. So we definitely do try and work together. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm Kristen, and I'm at the Columbus Regional Airport Authority. Thanks so much for the presentation today. This was very informative. We are working to sort of renew some of the efforts that we've had over the course of a number of years around human trafficking. And if you guys have any advice or guidance on training for our frontline employees and recommended best practices, such as, would you recommend mandating it? Is it better? Is a virtual presentation okay? Or do you have recommended videos or resources that we could utilize?
So I feel hesitant mandating trainings as someone in government. However, sometimes that is how you have to get people to the table. So I think that's, I think, a kind of agency specific decision that you all could make, but there are I think great videos online, and I can send you some federal videos of trafficking. Before COVID, I would always say I prefer in-person trainings just because I think you can make that connection. Sometimes you can have additional guest speakers. But I know, like, from the state's perspective, we won't resume in-person trainings probably at least until the fall. So depending on your timeline, a virtual training might be best. One of my colleagues has done training specific to airport staff and kind of looking at what that could be. So she could also be a resource to you, Kristen. So if I could, would you mind dropping your email in the chat box and I could send you some resources and maybe have a longer conversation? Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you everybody for your time today, for paying attention to this very important subject to the state of Ohio, and seeing as though, again, they have to move people around, and we are a main source of transportation in the state, and airports reach beyond our own borders. So thank you for paying attention to this very important issue. If you have any questions for me, you know how to reach me. In case you've forgotten, it's just stacy@ohioaviation.org. And you can either spell it correctly, STACEY, or forget the E, it'll get to me either way. Thank you so much again. Tara, Sophia, thanks again, and we'll keep in touch soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
All right, thanks, bye-bye.